Hello, my name is Mac, also known as Mickey D in some online circles, and I recently won the 1K held at Atlas Games here in Ankeny, Iowa for Star Wars Unlimited with Palpatine Green. I saw some online comments and some questions and thought I'd hop on here, give my thoughts, give a rundown on the deck, some of its matchups, some of its key cards and cards to watch out for, and any potential changes I would make going forward for the deck. So, before I get started, I do want to give a shout out to some people. Shout out the KTOD crew. Their Discord server has been a great resource for me in terms of both getting ideas as well as just keeping my competitive interest in the game. Specifically, Maddie is one of the members there that threw in some ideas for this Pal Green deck, as well as Pokari, who you are on the server, was very active leading up until this 1K and really kind of helped me formulate some ideas and solidify the deck in a lot of ways. Locally, I mean, there's too many people to shout out. Shout out all the stores that host for the local area. You're wonderful, all of you. And then local testing people, my roommates Joe and Kenny, Adam, Brad, anybody, all of you people that helped play with me any games. So just shout out to the local area. We have a great crew out here. So if you're ever in Iowa and want to play some Star Wars Unlimited, just hit us up. You'll be able to find a game, I'm sure. All right. So this is the overall deck list. We won't stay on this screen too long because I'm going to go kind of card by card here. But just as a theory for deck building that I personally enjoy is I like extremes and I like a lot of 3-ofs and 2-ofs. So I want consistency in my decks. But kind of opposite that, I also like the extremes. So Devastator and Relentless are very extreme cards, right? They're heavy hitters and they're very good in certain matchups and kind of unplayable in others. You could argue the same thing for a Salacious Crumb. That's great against the aggro decks, but is very not unusable, but very difficult to use profitably in certain control matchups. So that's kind of how my deck building philosophy is, just in general. And let's start getting into the card by card here on individual card choices. Another way I like to think about deck building is kind of in buckets or in groups of cards that are doing similar things for me. And that way it can kind of dilute a giant deck list of however many cards down into bite-sized chunks. First chunk for this deck is going to be your 2-cost officials. Official is a big tag for this deck because of the Emperor's Royal Guards. Giving them Sentinel is huge, as we'll see in a couple slides. Having a Sentinel on turn 2 is your game plan in a lot of certain matchups. And having almost all of your turn 1 plays be able to turn on that Sentinel for the Emperor's Royal Guard is really big. My favorite of the bunch is Yularen. I don't know if it's the best of the bunch. It is the one I tend to use the most, however. Scanning Officer is busted in some matchups. It's never really a bad card, but being able to hit smuggle cards on turn 1 if you have the initiative and your opponent has 1 2-cost unit they can play, you hit a smuggle card that they resourced, it comes in exhausted, the resource that replaces it skips their turn 1 play. That's huge. It's a card I need to learn how to play with a little bit better, using it in the later turns and how to time it. But I know a lot of people are really high on this card. It's probably my least favorite of these 3 officials. However, I don't really see myself running less than 3 of it. Piet, if you know me, is a card I have had a storied history with. I used to absolutely hate this card, especially in set 1, and was running it kind of out of necessity because you just wanted another official because we didn't have Scanning Officer back then, and it was really the second best one behind Yularen. However, it is really big in a couple of key ways. 4 health on turn 1 is really hard to deal with on turn 2. And so if your opponent has the initiative, they have to invest more resources into getting rid of Piet. And they're not likely to do that, which means your official is more likely to survive, which means your ERG is more likely to have Sentinel. Another huge play pattern is since it's a villainy unit, you can grab it off of Vader. And a 7-cost Vader into an 8-cost Reinforcement Walker with Ambush is really big. So all of these guys and gals perform very well. And I don't think I would cut any of them. there's different kind of packages you can run, and later on we'll talk about kind of cards you can change in and out. But I've been really enjoying the 9 official package and going heavy on Sentinel. There isn't much else on turn 1 that you're super excited about. We have some space, because space is, if you've seen any of those nasty Tarkin decks running around, is something you kind of have to worry about. And so we have to make some concessions to that. They also have some utility outside of that. So the 1 cost allows you to cycle it, magic turn, meaning to draw a card, on turn 1. So you play it for 1, and then you use Palpatine's ability to defeat it and deal damage to anything and draw a card on turn 1. So that can come up if they happen to play a 1 health unit, great. If it's just something with a shield, like a Crafty Smuggler, also great. And even just preventing some space units from being played, throwing it out there, even in front of like a Green Squadron A-Wing, can be okay. But it's especially to block those 7 Fleet Defenders, and more particularly those lurking TIE Phantoms. Outland TIE Vanguard is kind of, honestly, a very similar card. It's very good for buffing your Sentinels. That's kind of its main use, but even buffing your officials to 3 power. So let's say they play a Sabine unit and you throw down a 2-3 official, one of the 2-3 officials. They should probably be trading into your Sentinel, to be honest. Advice against Palp, trade into the Sentinels if you can do so profitably, because turning the Sentinel off of ERG, I should say trade into the officials if you can trade into them profitably, because turning off the Sentinel for Emperor's Royal Guard is huge. But say they use their Sabine, they play their Sabine turn 1 and just attack your base with it. Outland TIE Vanguard, to make your official 3 power, can trade into that profitably now, and then you have something to ping. Say they play like a Fighters for Freedom. Ping it, and now you have a 3-2 against their 3-3. So it comes up in a lot of niche scenarios, but don't be afraid, especially in certain matchups, to just play this out in turn 1 for no value. It's still a 2-1 space unit that's going to stop their lurking TIE Phantom. It's going to stop, not stop, but like clog up the space lane for 7 Fleet Defender and Cartel Spacer, Green Squadron, all these kind of things. It's not its best use, obviously, but don't be afraid to do something like that. Crumb is a bit of an outlier in this deck list, and we'll get into this later in the video, but he comes up in the Sabine matchups. The healing is nice. The ping is nice. It is a little less effective than when I initially built the deck. I thought it would come up more. Not particularly. Even if you're getting to 13-14 resources, you're often using a lot or all of them. And so it's hard to weave this in sometimes. And also sometimes he's just a 1-3 body, heals you 1. You're going to ping him away with Palpatine to draw a card. Next up, our turn 2 plays. We'll start with our Sentinels, our 3-cost Sentinels. Emperor's Royal Guard is huge. It is kind of not the build-around card in the deck for me, but is kind of one of them. A 3-5 for 3 in set 2 is a little less special than it was in set 1, but it's still very helpful, and giving it Sentinel is huge. So just I don't want to call it a vanilla card, but it's just a 3-5 wall on 2, and it can kind of help wall you out in the aggro matchups. And it's like not a threat against the control decks. It's not your best threat, obviously, but it can be something. Phase 3 Dark Trooper is just a strict upgrade to Cell Block Guard, which we were playing in set 1 because we wanted more Sentinels. It's better enough that I went up in count. In set 1, I was only running 2 Cell Block Guards in that slot, and now I'm at the full 3 Phase 3 Dark Troopers. It being green is actually kind of important for Yularen, can heal you off of Yularen when you play it. And then it's a great target. This is probably the best target in the deck for your Outland TIE Vanguards and even the experience tokens from Command. Because just giving it more health to survive more combats, to let it grow even more with its ability, is huge. And then also great once it's big, overwhelming barrage target. It's very nice. Black Sun Starfighter, funny story about this card. This and Endless Legions were revealed in the same day. Endless Legions being the 14 cost double green card that just spits your resource row out into the battlefield. And from day one, I thought this was the best card revealed that day for this deck. Black Sun Starfighter, I was always like lamenting the weakness of space in Palpatine. A Wing Leader and 7th Fleet Defender were kind of some of the scariest cards for me in set 1, just because it's like you're getting beat down in space. And with Wing Leader, you're getting beat down in other places too. And so just having a wall, it doesn't even necessarily have to trade. It eats an action and like heals you for 5 or 3 or whatever in space. That can be enough sometimes. Like a wall out for Fett's Fire Spray. They have to attack into it or waylay it to your hand, in which case they're not waylaying anything else. That's huge. And if they do attack into it with Fett's Fire Spray, well, now their Fett's is damaged and you can steal it with Palpatine. So really big card for this deck. The fact you can get it off Vader is big. Yeah, just such a good glue piece for this deck. Now this is kind of the heart of the deck a little bit. Palpatine, I call the deck, as you saw on the first slide, this is 9 ramp Palpatine. You're playing 9 ramp spells, you're trying to ramp to big dumb idiots to win the game with. And so Resupply and Super Laser Technician are kind of the heart of that. In some matchups, they're not amazing. Like in aggro decks against Sabine and the like, you don't have time for this. You're going to get beat down before you can make use of that resource advantage. But anything slower than like Boba Green is really kind of my tentpole of, all right, Boba Green and slower, you can kind of start to take advantage of that ramp. And we'll talk a little bit about Boba Yellow as well, but in that matchup, I think so as well. But, you know, it's ramp. Super Laser Tech especially is very, very good with this deck because other decks sometimes struggle with Super Laser Tech if no opposing ground unit is presented to defeat it and like run into to then resource your Super Laser Tech. But with Palpatine, you never have to worry about that. You'll always have a way to get your Super Laser Tech into your resource route and take advantage of that ramp. All right, so Enterprising Lackeys is a little tacked on here. It is a very good card. It's a good body to throw out on turn 3 against Sabine because it can threaten to trade with the Sabine, then follow up with the Overwhelming Barrage the next turn. I think it's pretty good, but this is mostly a slide for me to gush about Command. I think Command is my first or second favorite card in this game. It does a lot while not feeling like it does too much, and always creates like interesting play lines. So at its core, it's kind of a ramp piece. It's a ramp piece that does something else though. So it is a critical card in the aggro matchups because it allows you to start stabilizing the board while also still ramping, because your game plan is to ramp to get to your Overwhelming Barrages, your Darth Vaders, your Reinforcement Walkers, and win the game from there. But it can also, if you need to in those matchups, buff a guy with 2 experience counters and then fight something down. So it's like, not only is my Sentinel now blocking your Sabine from attacking me, I also took out your Green Squadron A-Wing. In the control decks, it's my 3rd and 4th copy of and 5th copy of Relentless while also ramping me faster, or making my Palpatine leader bigger, which makes it more of a threat, or even a removal potentially in those situations. It just does so much in every matchup. It's your best card against aggro, and it's one of your best cards against control, and it's one of your best cards into mid-range, and so it's just always doing what you want it to do. It is that, in my opinion, it is like one of the core hearts of the deck. It is the reason to play double green, in my opinion. It's just insane. I think it's underexplored for 6 on a lot of decks, but I'm a green palp guy. I haven't tinkered too much with many other lists. But my opinion, I absolutely adore Command. So next is kind of your stabilizing force. These are the cards that are taking you from the early game to the late game. You can call them mid-game cards. That's pretty much what they are, but I like to think of it more as, so early game, I'm setting up, and then these cards help me stabilize the board to pivot into my late game where I'm ahead. Overwhelming Barrage is kind of the core example of this. Throw it on your Enterprising Lackeys or one of your Sentinels with 1 or 2 experience counters. Take out a couple things, and then being able to trade into another thing with your buffed guy now. Huge stabilizing factor. And even if like your opponent is playing around the Overwhelming Barrage, don't be afraid to use this as a strike true that deals 2 extra damage and buffs your guy for 2 extra. I've done that many a times, and often it's not amazing, but it is enough to get you to the next 2 turns and allow your other stabilizers to help you to get to the late game where you're favored. Traitorous is a very specific card for this deck, in my opinion. In set 1, it was kind of the way you beat Sabine. With Poe existing and disabling Fang fighters creeping into more sideboards and even some main decks of certain decks, you can get blown out when you play this card. So be careful. Paying 5 for a Traitorous and then having the upgrade defeated, there's no coming back from that. If you have, please let me know. I'm sure it's an incredible story. I don't think I ever have. If it gets waylaid, it's better because they're bouncing their own thing back to their hand, as well as using the 3 resources, so it's more of a tempo play in that case. But be wary, especially of the Poes and the disabling Fang fighters. But let's talk about why Traitorous is good. Lurking TIE Phantom, 7th Fleet Defender, mostly the space units. It's great for stealing those. And even if that stealing is temporary, because those decks are often the ones running Waylay, again, buying a turn or 2, allowing to get to your Reinforcement Walkers, your Relentless, your Devastators to take over the game. It's kind of the game plan. And Darth Vader, this is another, I think, core card of the deck in a lot of matchups. It's one of your best cards. Being able to often get a Sentinel out while also removing an enemy unit is huge. It's like attacking into a Sabine, or really anything that's just kind of lingering around, a Boba unit, a Forlome, stuff with damage on it, some of the Sentinels, and then getting a Sentinel out to wall back, or even if you get like a couple of space units, because you can get multiple cards off of it. So let's get a TIE LN and an Outland TIE, and then that gives you fodder to then ping something with Palp and steal their unit, which is kind of what you're stabilizing to. So Vader is huge. Obviously, Darth Vader is one of the best cards in the game. I don't think I have to tell you that too much, but specifically in this deck, it's great at grabbing Sentinels and letting you survive till the Palpatine flip turn, Reinforcement Walker, the late game where you're favored. Speaking of the late game, here are the finishers. They're each good in specific matchups. So Reinforcement Walker is about as high as you want to go on resource cost against aggro decks. It with Piet, I was talking about earlier, is especially backbreaking against the Sabine decks. Gaining 6 while also clearing a unit is huge. And every game I've done that against a Sabine deck, I think I've won from there, which makes a lot of sense. Relentless, on the other hand, is your main answer into control. Control, like, they've gotten better answers to it recently, but it is still really awkward for them to deal with. I'll talk about it a little bit more in the key cards in the control matchup, but you're kind of the beatdown in those matchups. You want to get to Relentless a couple turns early, and then while they're floundering to answer the Relentless in these awkward ways, you can deploy a big enough board to kill them very quickly while also avoiding trying to get blown out by Super Laser Blast. Devastator is such a good stabilizer against air decks, and surprisingly very good into Boba Yellow and any Boba deck really because of Fett's Fire Spray. The dealing 10 damage, being a 10-10 overwhelm is huge, obviously. Like it clears out pretty much every leader except for Jabba on the turn you can play it, and oftentimes you can get to the 12 resources for it to be able to deal with Jabba. But honestly, its biggest boon I have found is just being a 10-10 Sentinel in space. They can attack through it with Fett's Fire Spray. They have to invest like usually at least 2 units into it, if not like 2 units in a surprise strike, or 3 units, or they waylay it back and then you get to Devastator them again, stuff like that. And so the Sentinel is a huge line of text on this card. It can often be too slow in certain matchups, but it is like once you play Devastator, it is hard to lose control of air unless they like take it or like vanquish it or Rivals Fall or something like that. All right, so this is the sideboard. It was a little bit iffy, I won't lie. Week 1, so we were trying some new stuff out. these top 3 cards were interesting. Confiscate. Some of the cards I was most scared of were Darksaber and Boba's Armor. And I beat Boba's Armor a couple times throughout the day without the use of Confiscate. It was a little clunky and not necessarily the most fun, but it's possible. And then I never saw a Darksaber all day. So we'll talk about it a little bit later, but I plan on moving away from Confiscate some and just trying to have different game plans against those upgrades instead of just straight hoping to draw the Confiscate when they draw the upgrade that's scary. That's a bit of a like magical Christmas land for those two things to line up, because you'll be resourcing Confiscate early because there's just better cards you need in those types of matchups, and then once you've resourced it and they have it, you can't use it, and so you kind of have to top deck it on the turn they're going to play their scary upgrade, and that's a bit too much to ask in my opinion. Strike True is a very good card, and we'll talk about it in a bit about once we get to changes in the deck. I'm definitely going to keep it somewhere across the main deck side deck in some capacity. It's very good at, if you've noticed, there's no 6 costs in the deck. Often that's because you're ramping past 6 from 5 to 7, like going from 3 to 5 and then from 5 to 7 resources. But in aggro matches specifically, oftentimes you're not ramping unless it's with command, and so you go from 4 to 6. And so in that hole on 6, I like to sometimes play a 3-cost Sentinel plus a Strike True, and that's a good pairing to get you to stabilize into your Vader the next turn. Fell the Dragon is specifically for what it's named on the card, felling the Crate Dragon. Crate Dragon, in my head, was a very scary card because a lot of your answers to it were very expensive, like Devastator's the clear one. Even Overwhelming Barrage, you have to have a big unit out, so maybe you have to play the big unit plus the Overwhelming Barrage to deal with the Crate Dragon. But I found in testing more and playing throughout the day that I was often in positions where I could throw enough stuff into the Crate Dragon, either because I stole some of their big stuff I could trade in, or I just had like a Vader and a couple Sentinels lying around that I was more than happy to trade in for a crate. Plus, you have Palpatine steal, and so you can often position the board to steal their Crate Dragon or steal their big thing and get them dead before the Crate Dragon really matters. It did come up throughout the tournament. I used it on a Han Solo unit. I had a couple times where it would have been good. I was holding on to it against a Boba Blue player at one point for their Avenger if they ever had it. Eventually ended up resourcing it because better cards came up. There was also times where it came up against like Poe and Wrecker, and it's a bit clunky into the Sabine matchup, but it's better than a Relentless and Devastator. But I think it's narrow enough that I wanted to try it. Shout out to Joe, my roommate, for suggesting it to me. It was a very clean answer to Crate Dragon if it ever came up, but I think going forward it's not necessary. These bottom 2 cards, however, are cards I definitely plan on keeping in the sideboard. Palpatine's Return is often just 2 extra copies of your best unit in the matchup. Doesn't matter if it's a Force unit or not. If you get the discount, it's great. If not, I think you're fine paying 9 for Relentless out of the discard pile against a control deck. Like, they spent this awkward turn, like, burning a restock, and then Rivals Falling or Felling the Dragon, you're Relentless, and then you can play 1 card and it's right back out on the field. And so it's often just good enough as play a unit out of the discard pile. Like, the Force discount isn't nearly as important in this deck as it is in others. And then Maul. He is specifically important against 7 health leaders. So oftentimes by turn 5, you can get to 7 resources. So you can go from 3 to 5 and then from 5 to 7. And then that's the turn that Bobas start deploying, and then like your other Bobas and your Gar Saxons, and I can't think of other 7 health leaders, but there's off the top of my head, but there's plenty of them. And Maul is very good at just getting rid of them. Don't be fooled on like trying to wait for the leader to deploy to throw Maul into it. If they have like a Boba unit on the ground, that's ready and everything else is exhausted and they haven't deployed their Boba leader, just maul their Boba unit, and then sure, they'll get to attack with their Boba leader and get an attack off, but then you have a 7-3 ready to trade for the next turn with their Boba leader. So even just its presence on board doesn't necessarily have to get the ambush off against the leader. The presence on board can often be enough to dissuade a super potent deploy turn from the 7 health leaders. So these are some cards that I've seen floated about as inclusions in the list, or cards I was thinking about. And I, to varying degrees, think they're reasonable or not reasonable. So let's go over them a little bit. Timely Intervention, I think, is an insane card. And Gamorrean Retainer is a really good 2-cost that also helps you get Sentinel. But space in the deck I found to be a little tight. And there's a 2-cost card that can give ambush to the things that are important to give ambush to, while also turning on Sentinel for specific units, and that's Piet. So I think you just take your Timely Intervention and your Gamorrean Retainer and collapse them into one card in Piet, and that gives you more space across the rest of the deck list for other certain cards. Finalizer is, I think, a little too slow, and honestly, the biggest problem with this card compared to Devastator, because it's an expensive green-black starship that removes things, is that it doesn't have Sentinel. Sentinel is a huge line of text on Devastator that I don't know if it's overlooked, but it seems innocuous at first. And then while playing games, you realize being able to slam down a piece of removal for a ground unit while simultaneously stabilizing space is really big. Finalizer, in theory, can stabilize the whole board by removing everything, but then you're way more susceptible to the removal, and I just find it unnecessary. Endless Legions, similar to Finalizer, I find just very unnecessary. It's horrendous against the aggro matchups, which are kind of your tough matchups to begin with. And so you're increasing percentage points potentially against matchups you're already favored in. But I think instead of resourcing my Relentlesses and my Devastators to get them out with Endless Legions all at once, I'd rather just play them on curve and kind of be the aggro in those kinds of matchups and beat them down with 8/8s and 10/10s over the course of 2 or 3 turns, as opposed to trying to pull them all out in one turn. It can be a blowout, specifically in Palpatine Mirrors or in the Palpatine Green Mirror, and it's just a really fun card. I will not lie, it's a super fun card to try and pull off, so more power to you if you want to try and make it work, but I think it's just a bit too slow, a bit too cute. You just want to be more efficient. So now that we've gone over the deck list, I want to go over some cards to look for and some ideal hands in specific matchups. So for Sabine Green and other aggro decks, it is a very specific set of cards you're looking for. You want an official on turn 1. Depending on if you have the initiative or not, depends on what official you want. So if you have initiative, you want Yularen most likely, because the healing over time can be enough to stabilize you into the late game. If you don't have the initiative, you actually want Piet, because Piet can survive any turn 1 attacker without help, as far as I'm aware. So like they'd have to throw a Heroic Resolve or a Heroic Sacrifice on their turn 1 play in order to be able to remove your Piet. And so the more stable the official, the better in that case to set up for your Emperor's Royal Guard. Speaking of Emperor's Royal Guard, you want a 3-cost Sentinel in your hand. The one I'm mostly looking for is Emperor's Royal Guard, because it's just got the biggest booty and will survive the most things. And you just want to basically throw units out there as like plus 5 HP or plus 7 HP while also sticking some damage to get to the late game. Black Sun Starfighter is probably the one I'm looking for next, because you are vulnerable in space. And so throwing down a Black Sun Starfighter to be able to hit a green squadron or trade with red 3 can be helpful. There's a bit of a tap dance you do of do they have the space or do they not? And it's hard to predict sometimes, because often it's just dictated by opening hands. But do be wary of that. That's probably the one I look for next. But Phase 3 Dark Trooper is also a totally fine Sentinel. You just want something to play on turn 2 that'll prevent you from getting hit. Turn 3, I am almost always looking for command. I think command is the most important card against Sabine and into the aggro matchups in general. Like I was saying before, it can help you stabilize by removing a unit while also getting you ahead on ramp, or it can make your sentinel bigger to more effectively trade into 2 units as opposed to just 1, or 3 units as opposed to just 2. It often makes your ground sentinels, always makes your ground sentinels actually, big enough to trade into Sabine. It also lets you fight cross lane, specifically against Green Squadron A-Wing. And so I think command is just the nuts against aggro. But Enterprising Lackeys is also very good. As I was saying earlier, it effectively trades into Sabine while staying alive. It's a great overwhelming barrage target, which is the next card that we're looking for to clear the board. So, and then overwhelming barrage, just a nuts card in general, but especially against aggro, being able to clean up the board, again, fight cross lane, because you're often going to be gumming up the ground, and so being able to kill all of their space units with this and then effectively trade in, super powerful. The aggro matchup is certainly the toughest. I've been theorizing some ways to try and make that matchup a little bit better post-sideboard with new sideboard options. But there is a game plan, and I think that's important, even in your tough matchups, to try and find some sort of game plan that can work, that can get you the victory, even if you are not likely to, and against their best draws, even with your best draw, you can never beat them. Having a game plan is important. And as a little tangent on that, I do want to talk about, if you plan on playing this deck, do not be afraid to mulligan. There was a great quote I heard from somewhere in the Magic sphere. I forget where, but it was, you do not have to mulligan, you get to mulligan. And so oftentimes when you're looking at an opening hand and you're thinking about mulliganing, you're trying to convince yourself to keep the hand. Oftentimes you're trying to convince yourself to keep a subpar hand and hope you draw out of it. And while it's not always the best to be doing this, I often try and sit down and think, trying to convince myself to mulligan the hand. So looking down is like, well, I have all these good pieces, but I'm missing a critical piece. Should I ship it back? Oftentimes the answer is no. I'm not saying you should mulligan every single decent hand to look for the nuts, but do be aware that it is important in specific matchups to dig as aggressively as you can for the critical cards. Play to win, do not play to not lose. And mulliganing is a way that you can play to win from before the game even starts. All right. So now let's talk about the tempo decks. Tempo is kind of hard to describe, but boba yellow style decks that are bouncing your units and tapping stuff down while also presenting threats. This is an interesting matchup where I think the most effective strategy is to try and get to like Vader as fast as possible. And specifically against boba yellow, the way I play the matchup is to try and neutralize their deploy turn as much as possible. And the best way to do that is to not present them any units to remove from play so that they don't get the 3 resource rebate on their deploy turn. That being said, you still want to play some stuff early so you're not getting completely run over. So turn 1 official to turn 2 sentinel, same thing as against aggro. That way you can kind of effectively trade on turn 2 and 3 and try and soak up some damage while also getting some units off the board. But then command, again, the nuts. It can buff your sentinels to make them harder to remove with effects other than waylay. It can fight stuff. It can ramp. It, again, just does everything. But I also think resupply is a pretty interesting and pretty critical card in this matchup. Boba Yellow I find to be one of the most interesting matchups with Green Palpatine just because it's a puzzle that I feel like there's a solution to, and I'm starting to try and figure it out. Do note, Super Laser Tech is way worse in this matchup than Resupply and Command because they can just waylay your Super Laser Tech, and then you are just down in action, down your resources. You don't get the ramp that you were expecting. So that's just kind of a back-breaking blowout. If it's your only ramp option, it's okay to play it, but I would definitely prioritize the resupplies and the commands over the super laser techs. You might notice too that I have the turn 2 Sentinels, but I also have a piece of turn 2 ramp in this kind of key card section. And so part of why I find this matchup so fascinating is you kind of have to let the draw come to you and play into what strengths your hand gives you. Whereas Sabine Green is a matchup where you kind of have to follow a hard and fast game plan in order to be able to win the matchup. I think this is a matchup you can kind of take a couple different play lines and be successful. I think that the ramp plan is more successful because if you neuter their deploy turn, that's often enough time to stabilize to get to your Vaders and then your Steels and your Reinforcement Walkers. But the Sentinel plan can be just as effective in stabilizing some and effectively healing some to get to the Vaders and stuff. And you can split the difference because of the card command. You can play a turn 2 official, turn 3 Sentinel, turn 4 command, and you're both ramping and doing the Sentinel thing, splitting the difference. So again, another matchup where I think command is kind of the critical card. But just as critical, I think, in this matchup is Darth Vader. It's a way to present both a Sentinel and a removal effect in one turn. It gets bodies on the board and bodies that are harder to get rid of. It trades pretty effectively into most of their threats, except for their leader, but their leader is going to be hard to deal with anyway. It's something that if they're on the Relentless Pursuit plan, is hard for them to get rid of via that card. And I think just in general, obviously Darth Vader is a super powerful card. Overwhelming Barrage is a card that's not on this slide that I do think is powerful in the matchup, but is very specific to if you're doing kind of the board game plan of official into Sentinel into like the Boba Green or the Sabine Green matchup. And so while I think it's powerful, the other thing is that Boba Yellow often has units with shields or units with big health. And so it's oftentimes just like removing a unit, getting rid of a couple shields, which is very, very good. Don't get me wrong. But I think there's better cards to be on the hunt for, which I think might be something that people think Overwhelming Barrage is a nuts card and nuts in the matchup. And I agree it's a nuts card and it's very good in the matchup, but I think there's just better options. It's a matchup I definitely want to test some more to see if the Boba Yellow opponent knows the game plan going in, that they can counter it better. Because, like, do beware, Bodhi Rook is very good against the ramp plan. If they Bodhi Rook and then, like, play on a new adventure on their Bodhi Rook to rip 2 pieces of ramp out of your hand, you're just going to lose the game if you're going for the ramp plan. That's how I lost game 1 of the finals of the 1K, was that exact line of play. But one's games 2 and 3 by ramping to Vader and then getting to Devastator and stabilizing from there. So it's a very fascinating and tough matchup, but it's one that's on the balance. And while right now I would say Palpatine is slightly unfavored in the matchup, it's a matchup I could see being even, or even crazily enough Palpatine favored maybe. Maybe that's sacrilegious and maybe I'm just being ambitious and wishful thinking here, but very fascinating matchup all the same. All right. So the mid-ranges of your Rey Reds and your Boba Greens and your Han Greens, Luke Greens, a lot of green, your turn 1 play isn't as important. Obviously, you like to have one, and specifically, I like to have a turn 1 play because it always means command second mode is online. Because with command, you do have to choose 2 modes, and they have to be different. And so if you don't have any units in play and no units in the discard, you have to give an experience token to a unit, and if your opponent is the only one with the units, you have to give one of their units 2 experience tokens. At least that's how I understand it to be. If I'm wrong, please let me know. But as far as I understand it, that's how it works. And so if you play a turn 1 unit, you will always have something to either get an experience to or return from the discard pile. So command can let you ramp. But yeah, you just want to ramp to your top end and stabilizers, and then to your big top end. So Super Laser Tech, resupply command into Darth Vader to kind of turn the corner, and Reinforcement Walker to turn the corner. and overwhelming barrage to turn the corner if you have a big unit laying out there. And then Devastator kind of shuts the door on the game, takes care of like a Luke or a Han Solo or Boba Leader if it's out there, or a Fett's Fire Spray, and just gets them dead quick. This game plan is a little bit more straightforward of just ramp to big stuff, and you're going to find that to be pretty similar for the rest of these matchups here. Soft control, like your Kira Greens, your blue-green villainy controls that are trying to control the game but not doing the Vigilance Mill restock plan. They'll often have Vigilance and will mill you, but they don't have the restock plan. Very similar. Super Laser Tech Resupply Command, huge. You just want to get ahead of them on resources to the point where you can present big enough threats that their removal can't answer, or multiple threats in a turn that overwhelm their removal. Darth Vader, I haven't played as much into Blue Villainy Control in Set 2 as I did in Set 1. I played a lot of that matchup in Set 1. And Darth Vader was huge in those matchups, specifically because of Gideon Hask. It was a very clean answer to Gideon Hask if they didn't give it an experience token. Can get you a Super Laser Tech, which is a huge play in these control matchups of letting you ramp from 7 to 9 to get to Relentless. And then Reinforcement Walker draws you the card. Can heal you if you need to. Do be wary that, especially with Kira can get a little bit aggressive with all those great units. And so the healing is nice. And then Devastator, and especially Relentless, just locks them out of the game. Oftentimes, it's hard for them to find an answer. And often I've seen lists moving away from Entrenched and the like. And so once they stick, they're going to start beating down pretty hard. So ramp into big threats, but your big threats that you want to prioritize are a little bit different. Specifically, Relentless is really good into control, while it's kind of medium into the mid-range decks. And now hard control. So very similar cards. I think there's one card different? Yeah, one card different. And you'll notice there's positioned slightly because against soft control, I think there's a beginning, middle, and end to the game plan. Whereas with the hard control decks like your Boba Blues, your Item Blues, Afra Blues, a lot of the restock Vigilance game plan decks, you really just ramp into your fatties because Vader is still good. It can get another unit out, can answer like a Pershing if it's lying around, which is important. But your biggest priority is just ramp into Relentless. Reinforcement Walker draws you cards. Devastator is a big threat. And Enterprising Lackeys is actually really big in these kinds of matchups because it just is a recurring threat that even if they defeat it, you can just get it back and go over and over and over again. In the quarterfinals match at the 1K, I was playing against a good friend of mine, Brad, and in our game 2, it was a super long, prolonged game where we both decked out and he had resources restock, but I had an Enterprising Lackeys that just came out 5 or 6 times, and eventually it was just enough pressure where between the draw damage and one attack from this thing, he was going to die before I did. So huge in those matchups. And then space. So you might notice one thing sticking out back there, but let's talk about the other cards first. Your space units are good against the space matchup. Who knew? Your early space units to trade into the Lurking TIE Phantom. Black Sun Starfighter is crazy good, just forcing them to trade into it. And then Devastator to kind of lock the game out from there. But Traitorous is really your big answer to the Lurking TIE Phantom, especially against Tarkin Yellow. If Palpatine Green gets more popular and Tarkin Yellow remains popular, I imagine they're going to start throwing in confiscates to be ready for the Traitorous, so be wary of that. But even if they TIE advanced their Lurking TIE Phantom, you Traitorous it, and next turn they waylay it or whatever, that's still a favorable exchange for you. It's you're clearing experience off of the Lurking TIE Phantom, setting them back 2 turns effectively, because they have to replay it and then ready it, and so they're not attacking on this turn. and they're not deploying anything else, Traitorous is really the key card to watch out for in the matchup. When the semifinals match, I played against a Turk and Yellow player, and in game one, I looked at my opening hand and saw 2 Traitorous, and I didn't even have to look at the rest of the cards. You probably should still look at the rest of the cards. The rest of the hand was also good. I had a piece of ramp to get to the Traitorous earlier. But yeah, Traitorous is by far the most important card in those matchups. So let's talk about, after the matchups and the lines of play, some cards that I am going to be changing moving forward in the list. So first off is Crumb. You might have noticed, I think he was the only card that did not show up on any slides of key cards to look out for and like cards you want in your opening hand. That's not to say it's bad in every matchup. In fact, I think it's quite good against Sabine and the aggro decks. However, I think it's a little too niche, a little too narrow, and a little too weak in the matchups where it's good in. Like, it's still very good into Sabine Green, but not like crazy, to the point where I think I'm going to remove it from the main deck. I still think I want it in the sideboard because in those aggro matchups, he is quite good. With a Ullr out, it's 2 health a turn, and you get to just recur that 2 health every turn. That can often be enough to survive into the late game and stabilize to where, like, there are some Sabine Green games where you have like a Vader and a Walker and a Devastator or a Relentless or something in game 1, but you're at 27 health. So if they rip a for a cause I believe in off the top, you're just going to die. And they also just have their ping if they're Sabine to just deal damage to you every turn. So being able to kind of counteract that every turn with Crumb is still very powerful. But I think it's more sideboard material than main deck material. So Confiscate and Feather Dragon. There are cards that came up at the 1K, and they're cards I played at the 1K. But actually, I don't think I played Confiscate. I did see it in some matchups, but I don't think I ever got the chance to play it. Feather Dragon, I did get the chance to play. There was some other situations where it would have been good, but I think there are better plans for those against those kind of matchups. Like I was saying, I think for the decks where Confiscate is good against, I think the plan is to just kind of ignore the upgrade as much as possible by throwing as many Sentinels out as possible until we get to the high-end stuff, and then letting the high-end stuff deal with it. Whereas with Feather Dragon, I think against the big unit decks, specifically Crate Dragon, we can just kind of outposition the board to get our fatties out first, and then either steal their big stuff or use like a Strike True instead of a Feather Dragon to deal with the big stuff. Along those lines, let's talk about these middle 2 cards first. Gamorrean Retainer is really good for the Sentinel game plan. I think I'm going to throw him in the sideboard as a 2 of or a 3 of. I think I have it listed as a 2 of. Just as more ground Sentinels to gum up the ground against the Boba's Armors, the Darksabers, specifically the Darksabers, and just Sabine in general. And the nice part as well is it's a 2-cost 3/2. And if you looked at the deck list earlier, we don't have anything that can trade into a 3 health unit early on in the game for turn 1. And so just having a 2-cost that can trade into a 3-cost is really, really nice. Strike True, I think, is just a more versatile card than Feather Dragon. It's good. It can be good into like a Crate Dragon, Home 1, other Devastators, Pose, Wreckers. But it's not quite as good as Feather Dragon against those cards, at least the Avengers, the Crate Dragons, Home 1s, those style cards. But it is also effective against like Sabine Unit or Sabine Leader or some dirtily space units like a Red 3 or Green Squadron, like a Millennium Falcon if you see those lying around. So I think it's just more versatile. Its ceiling is probably a little bit lower than Feather Dragon's was, but I think its floor is a lot higher. And so I wanted to add a little bit of a stabilizing force to the deck. Now let's talk about these 2 outside cards. They're a little bit spicier. So General Veers is a card that in set 1 I was playing I believe 2 of is what I ended the set on, because it was really good to get off of Vader. It can allow you to kind of aggro your opponents down a little bit. It allows you to attack into 6 health units with Vader very effectively. It buffs up your Sentinels to be a little bit tankier. And all of that is still true. It's just I thought deck space was a little bit tight. But now that we're trimming Crumb and moving him to the sideboard, I'm going to try one of Veer's again. Because 6 attack is a really critical number against Poe and Wrecker. If your opponent isn't ECLing Poe and Wrecker in, because if you somehow survive the first ECL, which hopefully you can do with new sideboard plans and the game plan listed before, they can still just throw out Poes and Wreckers without ECL, and they're still pretty tricky to deal with. And so being able to spike a Veers off of a Vader to be able to effectively trade and stay alive against both of those is really, really powerful. And then tech. So I think against control, you don't need too much help, but I still like having some tech, because post sideboard they can have stronger game plans against you, especially the yellow control decks. Heavy discard is often the way they get you. They strip down your resources, strip down your ramp to play a fair game against you up until the late game, and those are ways you can get beat and aggroed out, weirdly enough, in the control matchups, especially if you're going against Boba with like Fet's Fire Sprays. So to go into the late game, I think tech is, I haven't tried it yet, but I think it's really spicy because you can kind of resource your biggest threats and hide them from discard. So let's say turn 1, you see a Relentless and a tech in your opening hand alongside a bunch of ramp. Just resource those guys, and then once you get to a high enough resource total, you can play the tech and then play the Relentless from the resource row. And you hit it from all the discard, and it's still available to get. If they defeat your tech, well, you're also bringing in your Palpatine's returns. So you can Palpatine's return back your tech, or you can command to get it back. Or you have your Relentless stuck in your resource row now, that's fine. They're going to just defeat your Enterprising Lackeys eventually, so replace your Relentless in your resource row with your Enterprising Lackeys, and then Palpatine will return that back. So I think it's kind of this one last piece of the puzzle to be able to play across your discard, your hand, and your resource row against control decks. I'm also tinkering with like an Afra green list, and I found it really effective there in that kind of loop of command, tech, Palpatine's return. And so I figured, why not try it in Palpatine? Seems pretty interesting. So this is set 2 9-ramp Palpatine 2.0. There's 2 cards changed in the main deck. Salacious Crumb was removed for Strike True and General Veers as one ofs. And then in the sideboard, the Crumbs show up, as well as the Retainers. The second Strike True, a Miser's Tech, and then 2 Palpatine's Return and 2 Maul. So I hope this video was helpful for you. Thank you for letting me rant for however long this video was about Palpatine. It's been my favorite deck since set 1, since day 1. I've been tinkering with it, and I was very happy to be able to take down a tournament with my homebrew deck. So thank you for watching. If you have any questions, feel free to hit me up. I always love talking about the deck and trying to improve it and find different lines, as well as just helping the community grow and helping each other be better. So thanks for watching.